It was the spring of 2023, and suddenly, people had started hearing a word again that they thought they had forgotten years ago. Bank panic. There were red charts all over the television. The news anchors sounded more tense than usual. One bank had collapsed, then another one, and within a few weeks everyone started asking the same question. Is a new 2008 coming? People were talking about banks. They were talking about interest rates. They were talking about layoffs. And strangely, it felt like there was an invisible tension moving through the city. Restaurants were still full. Life looked normal from the outside. But if you looked carefully, you could see that small change on people's faces, especially in people whose lives revolved around money. And during that period, one of the people I spent the most time with was John. John was a real estate agent. But honestly, he wasn't just selling houses. John was selling the feeling of looking successful. Expensive watches, luxury restaurants, big talk, networking nights, confidence. And for years, I had never seen John scared until the spring of 2023, because during that time, I started noticing small things in John that I had never seen before. The way he constantly checked his phone, the way he stared at certain messages for too long, and those few moments when he suddenly went quiet. And honestly, I don't think John was afraid of losing money. John, let me tell you a story. That spring, I had started spending more time with John than usual. One day, we were driving around the city together again. John was behind the wheel, talking fast like always, looking confident like always. But that day, there was a different atmosphere inside the car. The radio kept playing economic news. Another bank had collapsed. The markets were red again. Fear about interest rates was growing, and people had slowly started using the word recession more often. Right at that moment, John's phone rang. The phone was connected to the car speakers. It was another real estate agent friend of his. The guy sounded genuinely stressed. A client backed out this morning. They don't want to buy the house anymore. People are starting to panic, man. I think things are getting bad. John immediately started speaking in a calm tone. Relax. People panic during every crisis. This is temporary. Fear creates opportunities. From the outside, John still looked like the same John. Calm, controlled, confident. But during that conversation, I started noticing something else. Because while John was talking, he kept glancing at the traffic screen and stock market news in front of him. But his voice and his eyes weren't saying the same thing. After the call ended, there was a few seconds of silence. John smiled slightly. Then he looked at me and said, "People are overreacting." And at that moment, I felt like he wasn't saying that to me. He was saying it to himself. About 20 minutes later, we were driving toward a huge house outside the city. This wasn't an ordinary house. Massive windows, tall palm trees, a private pool, and a giant terrace overlooking the entire city. As John drove toward the house, he smiled slightly. "If this sale goes through, I'll finally breathe for a while," he said. Then he let out a short laugh. But for some reason, it didn't sound like the laugh of a genuinely happy person. We walked inside the house. It was impressive, quiet, clean, and almost too perfect. John started showing me around. We moved from room to room. At one point, we stepped onto the terrace. The city looked tiny from up there. John looked at the view and said, "When people see houses like this, they think their lives will change." Then he shrugged. But a few months later, they become the same people again. I smiled slightly. Then we spent a few minutes talking about completely random things. Basketball, old school memories, Leo. At one point, John said, "Leo's definitely going to become a YouTuber someday." And I replied, "He'll probably make them more money than me." John laughed, and for a few seconds he actually looked relaxed. But the clients still hadn't arrived. At one point, John checked his phone. then immediately put it back into his pocket. "They're probably stuck in traffic," he said, and he kept talking, as if he didn't want silence to exist. He showed me the coffee machine in the kitchen, talked about the design of the living room. At one point, he even started explaining the lighting system for no reason. And honestly, that was the first moment I realized something. John wasn't trying to sell the house. John was trying to make the atmosphere feel normal. About 10 minutes later, his phone buzzed again. John read the message. This time, he stayed silent for a few seconds, then slowly locked the phone. "They want to postpone the purchase for a while," he said, "because of the markets." Then he smiled again. "People make strange decisions when they're scared," he said. He stared toward the terrace for a few seconds, then took a deep breath, and for the first time he looked like a genuinely exhausted person inside that giant house. I didn't say anything. John shook his head slightly. "Whatever," he said. "They'll probably come back in a few weeks." Then he shoved his hands into his pockets and let out a short laugh. We walked silently through the house for a while. Then I smiled slightly and said, "Come on. Let's go grab a drink." John looked at me. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That sounds good." As we walked out the front door, he looked back at the house one last time. One of the things I noticed about John that spring was this. He wanted to go out more than usual. He wanted to see more people. He wanted to attend more events. It was almost like he believed the more people he surrounded himself with, the safer he would feel. Because when people get scared, some become quiet. Some isolate themselves. And some do the exact opposite. They throw themselves deeper into crowds. And I think John belonged to the second group. A few days later, he called me again. "You're coming somewhere with me tonight," he said. "There's a networking event." Then there was a short silence, and in that same confident tone of his, he said, "It'll do you good to see people still spending money." But for some reason, it felt like he wasn't saying that for me. He was saying it for himself. That night, we went to a large hotel in the city center together. The event was being held in a large hall upstairs. There were men in suits standing near the entrance. Soft jazz music was playing inside. Servers were walking around with drinks. And from the outside, everything still looked normal. The moment John walked inside, it was like he transformed. His energy came back. He was shaking hands, laughing loudly, touching people on the shoulder, trying to look strong in front of everyone. At one point, he turned to me and said, "This is the real world right here. Everyone panics on the internet, but people with money move during crises." Then he grabbed a drink and disappeared into the crowd. Meanwhile, I stayed slightly behind and started observing people. And honestly, the energy in that room felt strange because people were smiling, but their eyes weren't. The same words kept coming up in conversations. Interest rates, banks, risk, waiting. After a while, John came back over to me. He had a drink in his hand, but this time, his energy wasn't as high as it had been earlier. He looked around the room, then shook his head slightly. "Strange times," he said. "People aren't afraid of spending money anymore. They're afraid of making decisions." Right then, two men walked past us. I still remember what one of them said. "I'm staying in cash right now." The other one immediately replied, "Same here." John went quiet for a second after hearing that. Then he quickly forced that familiar smile back onto his face. "People always do the same thing during crises," he said. "They panic and wait." But at that moment, even though John still sounded calm, he no longer sounded relaxed. At the beginning of the night, there had still been excitement in his eyes. It was like he truly believed this period would become a huge opportunity for him. But as the night went on, he kept hearing the same things over and over again. "Let's wait. Let's see what happens. I don't want to take risks right now." And after every new conversation, John would go quiet for a few seconds, then smile again, talk confidently again, and act like nothing was changing. But for the first time, I started feeling like John wasn't trying to convince other people that night. He was trying to keep himself calm. When the night ended, John offered to drive me home. The city looked quieter than usual. The roads were empty. Soft music was playing inside the car, and for a few minutes neither of us said much. John stared at the road. I watched the city lights through the window. Then John shook his head slightly. "That was a strange night," he said. "I didn't expect people to be this nervous." His voice was trying to sound calm, but he looked tired. I smiled slightly. "People stop thinking rationally when they're scared," I said, "especially when the news keeps feeding them disaster every single day." John let out a short laugh, then stayed quiet for a few seconds. "Maybe you're right," he said. We drove for a while longer. Then I turned to him and said, "By the way, that house was incredible. Someone's definitely going to buy it eventually." This time, John genuinely smiled. For the first time that entire night, the tension on his face seemed lighter. Then he nodded slightly. "Thanks for being here tonight," he said. "Honestly, I didn't want to be alone today." That sentence surprised me, because John normally wasn't the kind of person who said things like that. I smiled slightly. "Don't worry," I said. "The world will keep turning tomorrow, too." John let out a short laugh, and I think for the first time that night, he actually looked relaxed. And over the next few months, the news on television became even harsher. Another bank collapsed, then another one. Others were rescued at the last second. The same questions kept repeating on television. Is the economic bubble bursting? Is a new crisis coming? Does this look like the beginning of 2008? And honestly, even the energy of people in the city started to feel different during that time. Because when fear spreads, people don't lose their money first. They lose the courage to make decisions. And as time passed, John's life slowly started being affected too. At first, sales simply slowed down. Then people started waiting. Then deals started collapsing at the last minute. And eventually, the months John once considered normal stopped happening. But the interesting thing was this. John still tried to look like the same man from the outside. He still dressed well. He still talked about huge opportunities. He still sounded confident. But small things had started changing. One day, he came to pick me up again, and I noticed it immediately. The car was different, less flashy than the old one. I smiled slightly and asked, "One new car?" John shrugged. "The old one was becoming ridiculously expensive, he said. So I switched." Then he immediately changed the subject. But honestly, I could feel the slight discomfort in his voice when he said that. Because for some people, a car is never just a car. For some people, it's part of their identity. And I think for the first time in years, John was being forced to take a small step backward in his lifestyle. One evening after school, I stopped by John's office. It was late. The building was almost empty. Half the hallway lights had already been turned off. John's office door was open. When I looked inside, I saw him sitting alone at his desk. The computer was on. His phone was sitting on the table, but this time, he wasn't looking at either of them. He was just leaning back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The moment he saw me, he straightened up immediately and smiled out of pure reflex. "Well, look at this," he said. "The teacher came to inspect me." I laughed slightly, then walked inside and sat across from him. There were several folders on his desk. Some of them had the word "canceled" written across them in red marker. John noticed me looking at them, so he slowly pushed the folders aside. "People have gotten really strange lately," he said. "Nobody wants to make decisions anymore." Then there was a short silence. John shook his head. "People used to be afraid of missing opportunities," he said. "Now, everyone's afraid of making mistakes." For the first time, his voice sounded genuinely tired to me when he said that. I shrugged slightly. "This period will pass," I said. John let out a short laugh. "I hope so," he said, then leaned back in his chair and smiled slightly. At least your paycheck is stable, he said. I guess my entire life depended on other people's courage. I smiled slightly. But honestly, at that moment, someone else came to my mind. Tom. Because lately, he hadn't looked like himself either. And honestly, one of the strangest things about that period was this. The crisis wasn't touching everyone's life the same way. We were watching the same news, living in the same city, breathing inside the same atmosphere of fear, but everyone was afraid of something completely different. John wasn't afraid of becoming unemployed, because John knew how to work. He knew how to talk to people. He knew how to sell himself. Deep down, he probably knew he could always recover somehow. But I think John's real fear was slowly becoming invisible. Because for some people, success isn't just a bank account. It's an identity. And once someone spends years living inside that identity, even the possibility of losing it starts to exhaust them. But the interesting thing was this. John kept fighting anyway. He still went out. He still met people. He still talked like, everything will be fine. And honestly, sometimes I couldn't tell whether that was real confidence or just a defense mechanism created against fear. But beyond all of that, there was something else that kept making me think. Because during that period, it wasn't just John who was changing. The city was changing. People were changing. And slowly, I started realizing something. Economic crises don't just reveal markets, they reveal people too. Who can actually stay calm? Who panics? And who keeps moving nonstop just to suppress their fear? And I think that's why I started paying closer attention to people around me during that period. Same event, different people, different reactions. And I was about to see another version of fear in another friend of mine, Tom. And honestly, I think Tom's fear was far deeper than John's. Because John was afraid of losing his lifestyle, but Tom was afraid of losing his entire life. Because Tom's whole system was built around a single paycheck. The house, the bills, the loans, the insurance, and that paycheck arriving every month. John could survive for a while even without making sales, but for Tom, things were different. Tom's fear was becoming a former banker whose card no longer opened the door at work one day. And honestly, what I saw in Tom's eyes during that period felt even heavier than John's anxiety. Because John was still looking for opportunities. Tom had started living with the possibility that the entire system itself could actually collapse. And I think, for the first time during the spring of 2023, I started understanding this. The same economic fear touches a different wound inside every person. See you in the next episode, my friends.